It is my pleasure to be your moderator here today. And joining us here today, and I'll let them introduce themselves, is Matt Griffin and Brett Waltz from BAM Weather. Matt, would you please introduce yourself, sir?
Absolutely. My name is Matt Griffin. I am the Vice President of Meteorology at BAM Weather. I've been here for about 7 years, and I'm excited to chat about the weather with everybody.
Great, great. Brett?
Yeah, my name is Brett Waltz. I am a senior meteorologist here at BAM Weather, and I've been here for the past 8 years. And super excited to be here and chat about the extended range forecast for the summer.
Great. We also have two of our market development specialists with us here today, Ron Geis, Scott Prignitz. Ron, would you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're located?
Well, I cover the state of Iowa, and I guess we talk about time. I've been a little over 40 years with Corteva and Legacy Company previous to that.
And Scott.
Yes, thanks, Eric. I live in Southern Ohio. I'm from Iowa originally, but I have lived out east here for over 30 years, approaching the 40-year mark, kind of similar to Ron. So I
It looks
cover
like,
Michigan, Ohio, and I've been doing that for 10 years in this role.
and I know Brett and Matt are from the state of Indiana, so we've kind of got the whole Midwest covered here today, folks. We're going to be kind of kicking this off today, talking about all things weather. Now, I don't know how many folks have seen the most recent movie, Twister, but I'm pretty sure you didn't see Brett or Matt in those movies. But they do have the same passion as the folks in those movies, I'm sure, today. So, folks, let's turn it over to Matt, Brett, and we'll talk all things weather today.
Well, thank you so much. And no, we were not in the Twister movie, although I think that both Matt and I have had our turn at chasing some storms. But we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what the storm chances are as we go throughout this update. And the way that we like to start out an extended range forecast is really getting a good idea of where we're at, where we've been. And so as we look at our summer outlook, I think it's really, really critical to understand what the current drought conditions and soil moisture conditions are. So what I have here to start out as of June 1st, a look at the drought monitor and flash drought conditions. And we can see across much of the Midwest and the Ohio Valley, really not dealing with substantial drought conditions. We have seen some expanding, abnormally dry conditions in northern Illinois and northern Iowa as of late. What I really want to be keeping a close eye on and what we will talk about in this update is northern Illinois, southern portions of Wisconsin, eastern Iowa, and southeast Minnesota, where on the right, we're starting to see some of those brighter colors of the flash drought indicator pop up, which can be a precursor to some expanding dryness that we'll need to keep an eye on as we head into the start of summer. And on top of that, Matt, we've got warmer than normal temperatures pretty consistently across those same areas that have started to get a little bit drier.
Yeah, as we go forward in some of these slides, you're going to notice a pretty common theme, especially over the next 1 to 2 months, with this warmth above normal temperatures over the top in the northern tier of the US, cooler underneath. It's a very El Nino type of signal. We'll talk about the El Nino as we go along here, but essentially, when we talk about El Nino, just the warmer ocean waters out in the Pacific, and it's a very common theme for the temperatures. The good news, Brett, in these El Nino patterns, we're not typically dealing with that extreme heat per se. Now, obviously above normal warmth, but not that extreme heat that we've seen in some past years when we're in especially like a La Nina. So
Yeah, when you get the ridge of high pressure is what we call it to go so far north, it makes it difficult for those upper 90 to 100-degree temperatures to build in from the south, and it just makes it that more difficult to be transported north as well. The other thing with El Nino moisture, you do typically get a stronger jet stream that can transport more moisture into the United States. But the big key is, well, where exactly does that moisture go? Because it's not just going to rain everywhere all the time, as we know. If we look at the next couple of weeks, and I think we're really starting to feel this El Nino type of a pattern, it's going to be more favored in terms of the most widespread moisture across the plains. The Central Plains, Kansas, Missouri, and through portions of western Iowa and up into the Dakotas. For areas that have been running drier this spring, this should be a favorable setup for them as we head over the next 7 days. And I would anticipate, Matt, that that generally lingers over into that second week here on the right, June 10th to 16th, Probably the green colors indicating slightly wetter than normal conditions continuing for the middle of the country, but we need to watch that red circled area. That's the area the next 7 days that is a little bit less active in terms of moisture, and I'm concerned that data could continue to trend a bit drier in that red circled area, including parts of Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio through that June 10th to 16th timeframe.
Yeah, I'd say, Brett, these two maps next to each other, pretty good news for folks who are dealing with some drought conditions ongoing, because really, some of the droughts we showed earlier, that's where the rain's trying to show up over the next 2 weeks in some of those spots. You can see it's a little bit messy further to the west, the Western Plains, right, just east of the Rockies, but overall, plentiful moisture out into the plains and then even into the southeast U.S. as well over the next 2 weeks, which again, is a very much an El Nino type of flavor into the forecast.
Yeah, I think the bottom line here, Matt, is the western portions of the grain belt in a pretty decent shape for some key rains ahead. The further east you go, the more sporadic and the lighter rains are ultimately going to be, and that will be the area we need to keep an eye on to see some of those drier than normal conditions try to expand over the next few weeks, especially when factoring in what our outlook looks like for mid to late June. Now, I do see a cold front, maybe a couple of cooler days around the 16th to the 20th in a little bit more of a widespread fashion. But I expect that the temperatures trend back above to even in some cases much above normal as we head into the last 7 to 10 days of June, especially. And that can come with drier than normal risk as well. And so you combine right in the heart of summer some warmer than normal temperatures and slightly drier than normal conditions, and you will likely see some areas drying out, and you'll have some folks getting probably a little bit antsy for rain, in my opinion, once we look at things at the end of this June.
And again, that temperature outlook, the cool underneath, warmer above into the northern tier of the US. Again, similar type of theme as we're seeing over the next 2 weeks, and that really continuing through the end of June as well.
Good news for the plains, though, continuing to favor above normal moisture across the southern and the western plains. So, for areas that are still in need of some rain further to the west, they should be in pretty good shape. And I do want to make the note that while we're favoring below normal precipitation, it doesn't necessarily mean zero rain at all. I do think that there are some at least lighter opportunities in there, just not quite as much as normal. And when you again combine that with some of the temperatures, you can have some expanding dryness, which is what these maps highlight. Map on the left, where we expect that there's going to be more severe weather. I wanted to highlight that for the plains because I think hail and wind events could be more elevated this year. Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, down through portions of the southern plains. Maybe not as active from a severe weather standpoint in the Great Lakes and portions of the upper Midwest, but then you deal with some of the expanding dryness risk. And that lighter shade of yellow on the right, I think that's where we can see some expansion of the abnormally dry conditions. And I want to watch out for that darker shade of yellow to orange. That's the highest risk area, in my opinion, to see some expanding drought and increasingly dry soil conditions throughout the month of June.
Yeah, Brett, we're just in that time of the year where sometimes the rain can come at a price, right? Middle of summer, we've got the heat, the humidity building. You just get severe thunderstorms when you get in this type of pattern.
And a good analog year for this year is 2023 because it was very similar from an El Nino standpoint, which we're going to touch on here. That year had a lot of severe hail out in the plains. So I do think that that is an analog year from that perspective for folks to look at. Getting into El Nino a little bit more, I wanted to show you all where we are at right now. Right now, we are trending towards a very strong El Nino. And in fact, what I'm seeing here with the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean on the right, this is a classic precursor for a strong to a super El Nino. Some of the latest indications would hint that we could be looking at near or potentially the strongest El Nino on record, rivaling 1997 and 2015. Very rare. This is a very rare setup. We do not get it very much, and we don't get El Nino to develop so quickly very often. A lot of El Ninos hold off until September. We're already feeling the impacts of it right now. And if we look at the forecast by August on the right, we're looking at very warm ocean waters already in the equatorial Pacific, indicating a very strong El Nino as we head through the summer months. And so what we've done, what Matt and I have worked on over the past several weeks and months is, what does this typically mean? for our weather patterns across the United States as a whole. And it is a little bit tricky to an extent because of how rare this event is, but we do have some years like 2023 and 2015 and 1997 that were all stronger El Nino years to give us a frame of reference. I suspect that the influence of this year's El Nino may even be a little bit stronger than those. And what that means for June is top enologues generally favor the core of the warmth set up in the north central US. I suspect it's eastward shifted this year. I suspect that we end up warmer more so into Wisconsin and Michigan and northern Illinois and northern Indiana than what current analogs would indicate. And you can have that same theme with some of the drier than normal risk. On the right are analogs in terms of precipitation departure. You can see just these years alone would indicate the driest conditions, Iowa, northern Illinois, Wisconsin. I think you could maybe shift that a state to a state and a half west. Just because the Pacific jet stream is so strong this year, it just pushes everything a little bit further to the east compared to what we've had in past history.
Right. And we'll go over our official outlooks here in just a moment, but Brett nailed it on the head. Our jet stream is just a little bit stronger than some of these years. And so as a result, you can shift the pattern just a little bit further to the east than what these analogs are showing from previous years.
Now, the good news, I would say, as we work further and further into the summer season, the subtropical jet that's directly related to El Nino ramps up and it shifts further to the north, which can help open the door for timely rains. And I think that's really the key as we head into the month of July. I wouldn't say that it's a widespread soaked pattern, but you can certainly see less of the brown and the red colors here across the primary ag belt regions as a whole, and really the US in general. There's not a whole lot of a super strong dry indication. I suspect July could start out a little bit on a warmer and drier note and trend progressively wetter and a little bit cooler as we head into the back half of the month, as we head into really the key part of the growing season.
Which, Brett, leads us to the August analogs, which you can see are even wetter. And as the jet stream continues to advance to the north, we get a high pressure that develops into the southern tier of the US. And these messy, clustery type of systems love to ride the edge of that high pressure in the southern US. And you can see really the ring type of look you can see from southwestern California up and around into especially South Dakota, and then Iowa, south and east into the eastern ag belt, southern Ohio Valley, where you just get this, we call it a ring of fire type of pattern that can start to develop. And we think especially late July and then getting into August primarily, where that can really start to flex and show itself. And this would be a type of pattern where we get storm clusters, these messy large area of rain and storms that can form at the same time. Gets a little bit drier into the southern tier, far southern tier of the US, because of that high pressure I mentioned that develops into the forecast. With the better jet flow, you just get naturally a little bit colder around that high pressure that sets up. You can see in this instance, these analogs more suggestive into Texas. Outside of that, pattern cools down to a little bit of a cooler look getting into August.
Yeah, in general, the later and later you go into the summer season in these El Nino years, typically the cooler that it gets. 2023, even that wasn't a super hot summer overall. 97 was a bit cooler. 15 had some cooler air as well. They typically don't favor substantial sustained heat through the middle to the latter part of the summer months, which I think you can see that there, which brings us to how it all averages out in terms of top analogs for the season. Again, I think because of June alone, I would shift everything a state and a half to the east. I just think this year we're so extreme with how strong the Pacific jet stream is. Everything is just a little bit further to the east. And so some of the browns, probably more so into the upper Midwest, Great Lakes. But I would say as a whole, as we get progressively wetter throughout the season, we're not dealing with substantial heat. We get increased moisture down the road. I certainly do not think this is a worst case scenario, even if we take off some of the top end yield potential due to some of the hotter and the drier risks early in the season.
All right, Brett, drum roll. Let's show them the official outlooks. So here's our official June. It's much of the same of what we've been talking about, where we think just into the eastern ag belt below normal, and then into the Great Lakes, much below normal for the moisture, and then out to the west, into the plains, southern plains, portions of the deep south, where we could just see better moisture overall, and really much of the central interior portions of the country. And then this theme that I've talked about especially over the next couple of weeks. It's warm over the top, the northern tier of the U.S., even much above normals. Temperatures there into the eastern northern plains, upper Great Lakes, and then cooler underneath where we're going to have a little bit more influence of our jet stream down into the southern tier of the U.S.
Yeah, and you'll note, and I think it's important to note, this is almost the opposite pattern that we had this past spring, Matt. And that's because we've shifted from a La Nina this past winter to now quickly into an El Nino. And so a quick flip in terms of the pattern really started last month in May, continuing into June. And then it's as we work into July that we start to see that moisture lift a little bit further north and east. I wouldn't say that we're soaked across the eastern ag belt. You can see we're near normal in terms of precipitation, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, but better. And I think more and more timely rains, especially the back half of July. Still think we lean warmer to the north, but not as warm compared to normal. And the further south you go across the southern tier of the U.S., from northern Texas through the lower Ohio Valley and the East Coast, likely leaning a little bit cooler than normal, so less substantial heat waves for the mid part of summer. And then as we roll into August, Matt, why don't you take this one?
Yeah, and August, again, the more the high pressure setting up in the southern US should be a little bit drier towards the Gulf. And then the moisture flow around that high. You can see again, California up into the plains. And then the moisture trying to work more into the eastern ag belt, into the Ohio Valley. What we'll be watching closely, we're expecting some more high pressure that develops a separate area of high pressure near Bermuda. How strong or how weak will that be? If it's weaker than we expect, what some of the analogs are suggesting. Some of that green could be shifted a little bit further east into the eastern ag belt to say like Indiana, Ohio, and even in Kentucky. But given some of the suggestions, we're going to leave it at near normal. And then the further east you get, the closer you are to the high pressure, should be a little bit drier. And again, where that better flow is from a moisture standpoint should help support in much of the northern plains into the eastern ag belt, just a cooler overall temperature pattern as a whole, and then warmer further off to the west we are.
And then we combine all of that together, and here's how we think we average out for the 3 month aggregate as a whole: June, July, and August. Average out, bit warmer in northern portions of the ag belt, a bit cooler the further south that you go, and then you're wetter than normal in the plains, especially as we start out the season. We're seeing that right now. Start out a bit drier in the eastern ag belt, but again, get progressively wetter with that more active storm track towards the back half of the season. But I still think northern Indiana, northern Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, you probably average out slightly drier than normal. Much of that because of the first half of the season for the June, July, and August precipitation outlook, which leads me to our final point, which what does all of this mean in terms of corn and soybean yields? And looking
Yeah.
at this from a weather perspective, we can look at a couple of top analog years on this chart, and we have a mix of some years that were a little bit above normal in terms of the trend line yield, and some years that were a little bit below normal. And I think that that mix is because of the timing of when the rains ramp up. If we're a little bit slower, we probably are below normal this year in terms of corn yields. If we're a little bit faster with the rains picking up the middle part of summer, maybe you end up near or a little bit above normal. Our top analogs in our call right now would be slightly below normal, but I wouldn't say it's an excessively below normal corn yield crop this year. And then we look at soybeans here, and because of when the rains come in and where the rains come in, these are a little bit better. The average is just around or slightly above normal. You've got 3 of our top 5 analogs above normal yield, and the other 2 at or just below normal with the soybean yield. So all things considered, even with some of the dryness early in the season, I don't think it's the worst case scenario from a yield perspective. And then that is our weather segment. So I really appreciate you all having us to chat about that.
Folks, if you and I forgot to mention at the top of the hour here, if you have questions, there is a Q&A function at your box at the very bottom of the screen usually. Scott, Ron, any thoughts as you kind of look about hearing the weather there from Brett and Matt for your respective areas?
Yeah,
Well,
go ahead, Ron.
go ahead. Scott. Well, when you're mentioning a record El Nino, and I remember some of these El Nino years as being kind of extreme. So we're a little bit in uncharted waters here. But one of the things I see that's caught my interest was a cooler and wetter grain fill period. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. And if you look at the most recent Super El Nino 2015 in 1997, they both had some cooler periods the middle to latter part of the summer months. And
Okay.
I think that that could time up very well for the grain fill time frame.
Hmm.
Got any thoughts?
From the eastern Midwest perspective, I'm concerned because we are starting to feel the immediate shift from a wetter spring to that drier pattern that you're highlighting there. And then you show that carrying well into the season, which and this talk of extreme weather kind of concerns me as to how this might play out. The question I'd have is then, as you get into August, you show that wetter pattern. Is it safe to assume that kind of keeps shifting further east? In other words, does that potentially catch us at a bad time as we look towards harvest in the eastern Midwest? Is it potentially going to be too late for our crops and a nuisance factor later in the season? What do you think?
Well, I know, Brett, we've looked at some of the analog years, had some very timely rains towards the back half of the season. Brett, and if I recall correctly, getting into September, in terms of harvest, it kind of flips to a little bit drier as well.
Yeah, it actually does. The
Okay.
first part of the harvest season, and the reason for that is actually directly related to El Nino. In El Nino years, we typically get a very active West Pacific typhoon season, which reorients the jet stream and tends to lead to some late season heat. And so, if there's going to be a time frame where we could get a bit hotter, it's probably the very end of summer, especially the harvest season into September. And I think that it could be a bit drier to start, but there's also typically a quick flip. So I think it's key
Okay.
to get harvest going quickly in September because into October it does tend to get cooler and more active in general.
The last question I have is about kind of your confidence. How have the tools or modeling improved? You referenced some of the past years. Is our data analysis any better? AI coming into the play at all? What is your confidence today in making forecast predictions versus maybe what it was 10 years ago?
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Oh, I was going to say what one of the things we do and that we've talked about is we looked at the analog years, right? So years in the past, which fit the bill, the pattern that's ongoing and what we expected to do moving forward. And so we can plot those. We showed some of those, and then we can look at the modeling as a whole. And the good news is we see a match, right? Where the analogs the progression of the temperatures and the precipitation are overall matching what the models that go out that distance are showing. And so when we see those two match, it does lead us to a little bit higher confidence in the overall progression of it.
Okay.
And Brett, and correct me if I'm wrong, typically in these El Nino patterns, models just typically do a little bit better at seeing the pattern ahead. They like to see winds, the jet stream is actually present. So a little bit more defined type of weather pattern versus in some of the previous years where we've had La Ninas where things are a little bit more these weak waves in the atmosphere that models will typically struggle to show. And so I would say overall, because of the analogs matching the modeling and the El Nino we're in, we actually have a pretty high confidence into the forecast ahead.
Yeah, Matt, just to add on to that and getting a little bit even more precise with what our forecast is, I would say that probably the lowest confidence part of it, I'd say it's a higher confidence forecast overall, but the biggest question mark is just how far east do these June rains extend? There's probably going to be a pretty fine line between the plains and the Midwest in terms of drier than normal and wetter than normal. And I think the biggest question mark is does it wobble a state west or half a state west and wobble a state east? I think it's the precise placement of where the better rain set up in June. I feel pretty confident in the overall progression, but eastern Iowa, southern Minnesota, you're right on that line. And so a slight
Hmm.
eastward tick of the rains would put them in a better spot than where maybe they are at this time where it's gotten a bit drier.
Matt, Brett, one of the questions came up here is how can folks reach out to you if they have questions? Or I know you all are a service, but where would folks get more information from you?
Yeah, I would recommend just emailing us directly. So my email is matt, M-A-T-T, at bamwx.com, BAMWX.com. Brett is the same thing, but throw Brett there in front of the at bamwx.com and email us directly. We'd be happy to help you out
Awesome.
with any questions that you have.
Awesome. Well, Brett, Matt, thank you all for joining us here this morning. I think our audience had a lot to learn here this morning, and it's gave us probably a lot to think about, and really kind of is a nice segue in, Ron, I would say, to where we're talking about now is that we probably got a little better idea from Matt and Brett what we might be coming. Regardless if that's more rain, drier, all growers want to make sure that they are spending money wisely, and part of that's scouting. Can you talk to the folks a little bit about scouting
Mhm.
and what that all entails?
Yeah, and I'm glad that the meteorologist told us we're going to have a crop this year. So now the next phase is to finish it strong, and get as many bushels as we can. And so much of that does hinge on good, proper scouting and know what it is you're looking for, and then be able to take corrective action um, in order to maximize your yields. Here we go. So at this time of year, unfortunately, I will say a lot of scouting is done from the seat of the pickup truck and looking at weeds. And in as much as that's not ideal, it's somewhat plausible that you can see where some weed problems are from the truck. When it comes to diseases and it comes to insects, there's really no substitute for boots on the ground. So, what myself and the next speaker will talk about in the next segment here are some of those things to look for, and where to find them, how to find them. We'll start a bit by just the scouting patterns. Unfortunately, pest problems don't um, end up in the bottom right uniform category. They tend to be clustered around certain areas, or areas where maybe on a disease where more dew stays longer, say next to a tree line. So you need to have a good strategy on how to scout those acres so you're getting a good cross section of what's out in that field. Something else to keep in mind when we look at disease pressure in general is the good old disease triangle. Uh, Pathogens are, many of them are already in the fields. When we look at overwintering pathogens in soybeans, that would be white mold, that would be um, some of the frog eye leaf spot, some of the foliar diseases. Most of those will overwinter for long periods of time, or last into these fields for long periods of time. 5 to 10 years is pretty typical. So we start with a pathogen there, but then we have to have the host. All right. The host is the crop that you're growing. If you raise corn and nothing but corn, soybean white mold is not a concern to you at all, but the corn diseases would be. But to complete the triangle is the environment. And by and large, the environment involves moisture. When it's wet, that's when we tend to have more of the disease problems. But another element of that is temperature. So last year was one of those prime examples that you have to look at the entire triangle and all elements of the triangle. I'm going to take tar spot and soybean white mold. Both of those diseases really propagate when it's wet and somewhat cool. Well, what we had in the upper Midwest last year was nothing close to cool. It was flat out hot. And not having those cooler temperatures really kept white mold, and to a large extent tar spot, at bay. So my focus is primarily on soybeans. The next speaker will discuss corn. And you'll see this similar calendar pop up 3 or 4 times here. This is a soybean disease calendar that I'm referencing here. And when we will see infection times from different diseases in soybeans. So things like pod mottle virus can happen immediately. A lot of your root rots, Phytophthora, Pythium, Rhizoctonia, they'll tend to happen early in the season. And the defense against that is typically using seed treatments to address that. But the foliar diseases and really the rest of the what I'm going to spend time on, foliar diseases like white mold, like frog eye leaf spot, they aren't quite at the point yet where they're starting to infect those fields. When we have concerns of those diseases coming on strong, that's what can trigger a fungicide application. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on soybean white mold because when I listen to the meteorologists, we might be hot and dry, or certainly dry, up until we start getting into flowering, or certainly the last half of July, and definitely in through August. And that's when soybean white mold is really going to put the foot on the accelerator and the pedal to the metal. So based on the models, I'm going to say if you've got soybean white mold in your area, keep the foot on the gas on managing that with foliar fungicides. The timing that we typically look at on fungicide applications for soybean white mold is starting in early flower stage. I think based on the meteorologists, we may not be necessarily making an application that early this year, but once those fields, they might be more towards fully flowered, we'll say, which would be like an R2 stage. If that's when we start getting all this moisture, that's when white mold is really gonna want to take off. So we'll discuss a few products for white mold. I'm going to defer our new Forcevo to our next speaker because we'll primarily use that in corn, but it does have a soybean label. And what I like to point out, if you're one of these customers that have 80 or 90% of your acres are corn and a little bit that's soybeans, yes, you certainly can use one fungicide across all those acres. Our real strong offering when it comes to the majority of soybean foliar diseases is Viatude. So I like to say that if you've got a white mold attitude, you need Viatude. So Viatude is a combination of two active ingredients, both of which are best in class strobilurin, best in class triazole when it comes to white mold control. And as such, you're getting a good broad spectrum of disease control beyond white mold to some of the other things that we have for disease problems in beans. Viatude was new in the market, I think about 4 years ago when we got it registered. The features of it gives a faster uptake than other fungicides on the market. What brings a value to me with the fast uptake, we think about diseases, and diseases really being a big problem when it's wet. Well, if we can get that fungicide into the plant, then it is not prone to washing off the plant. When we combine the two active ingredients, we have a preventative, which helps to hold white mold populations out that are yet to come into that value price range. And as my understanding, it's taken over the top selling fungicide in that lower mid-tier price range. So brings excellent value and good results to go with that. When we look at the results on soybeans, we put Approach Prima, be it up against competitors or untreated, and we're seeing on average a 7 bushel per acre yield increase by using the foliar fungicide. Part of that is due to the plant health benefits that it brings, and certainly another part is due to the disease control that it brings. So that wraps up the diseases in beans. We'll move our attention to insects in soybeans. You'll notice bean leaf beetle starting right away. In the early 2000s, the neonicotinoid seed treatments entered in and have been a godsend from bean leaf beetle management. Otherwise, we were battling bean leaf beetles eating the soybeans off at the ground level as they were trying to come out of the ground. Neonicotinoids basically made that a thing of the past. The foliar feeding insects, spider mites, and then as we move a little deeper into the season, aphids and beetles and bugs, um, those can be a problem about any year. Some of the seed treatments help to suppress things like aphids for a little bit, but in the runaway years, we still would need a foliar application on aphids. The thing that I'm going to, maybe dovetail this with the meteorologist is we're starting out the season dry, and dry conditions tend to be more where insects tend to be a problem. So, thank you for giving us insect problems, and thank you later on for giving us disease problems. You guys are just a bundle of joy here. But when we try to evaluate what are we going to do for insects, a lot of times we just want to look at the defoliation that they occur. I realize you look in the lower right or the bottom part, and you're looking at 20 to 30%. And holy smokes, if I had a field looking like that, I'd be sick. And that's about the trigger point for most of these foliar fungicides, at least those that don't have like aphids that have an established number of aphids per plant. But a lot of the others are just based on defoliation. About that same time we introduced the Viatude, we introduced Ridgeback, a broad spectrum, multi-mode or two-mode of action insecticide featuring isoclast active. Now, let me tell you a little about isoclast. Isoclast will control aphids, and that is mostly it. So the straight isoclast we sell in a product called Transform. Controls the aphids that are there, but gives you, 2 to 3 solid weeks of aphid control. We've combined that in Ridgeback with a pyrethroid insecticide, but we're finding in the northern plains that we need something that's not a pyrethroid in order to control soybean aphids, because the aphids have developed resistance pretty readily to the pyrethroid insecticide, and that's where the isoclast comes in. One other point I want to make here. Isoclast is not the only product that will control aphids, foliar. You also have those from the neonicotinoid class that they do a good job of foliar aphid control. My only concern, if we use neonicotinoids as our foliar treatment, understanding that they make up the bedrock of our seed treatments, I think we're just asking for problems there. Here with the isoclast, we can totally switch it around and keep these insects, these aphids, off balance with another family that we're not otherwise using. And at the same time, with that broad spectrum pyrethroid, that allows us to pick up the beetles, Japanese and the bean leaf beetles, as well as the spider mites. All right, I'm going to switch over to the next speaker.
Thanks, Ron. We're going to kind of extend this discussion into the corn disease and insect prevention. And Ron did a great job kind of going over the weather impacts and tying that together in terms of how that impacts disease and insects in soybeans, and much of those same trends applied to the corn pests that we're trying to manage in terms of the diseases or insects. Let's make sure. Whoops, that was really fast. Let's see here. There we go. If you look at the scouting calendar for diseases specifically, this kind of takes in at emergence, or kind of where we are right now on corn in terms of early growth stages after emergence and on into the mid foliar stages, depending on where you're located. Stewart's leaf blight can take hold pretty early. And in that case, there are sometimes, I would almost say in some of these cases and some of these diseases, they're more rarely economic, but yet some of the prevention tools we have do a nice job. Probably the most investment on the fungicide space for for corn, or the most common area that we think about, gets into the foliar stages in the mid to latter part of the season, and that gets into the I think we'd call them the big four diseases in terms of the foliar aspect: gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, southern rust. That's definitely gained a lot of steam here lately, and especially out your way, Ron. It made an appearance that was, I think, surprising in the upper Midwest. And that has proven to be extremely economic in terms of economically threatening to the yield, and to the economically rewarding to make those fungicide applications. And then you move into the stalk rots, but tar spots in the middle there. It tends to, as a foliar disease, come in on the latter part of the season. As Ron highlighted, that's one that does thrive more in the cooler, wetter time of, and for that matter, it has been a bigger issue in the northern Midwest as opposed to the southern because of that weather trend. And so what was presented earlier may not be as favorable. And in recent years in the eastern Midwest, it hasn't taken a hold as much as we had seen prior. So it's just really good to pay attention to the weather. There are getting to be more weather modelers in terms of looking at current conditions and essentially forecasting what we expect to be the higher disease risk scenarios or conditions. And so we are improving some of the tools that way to kind of give us more predictability as to what to look for as the weather develops. But as far as the ear rots and gibberella, and some of the vomitoxin concerns that come in late in the season, those are harder to manage with foliar applications, but definitely have hit the radar as an issue in some of these seasons. If you look at the timing, there are fungicide applications going out as I speak here today in the eastern Midwest. They start in some cases doing that early application at around the V5 stage of the corn. That sets the corn up nicely in terms of plant health. In our case, we would look at approach, or in some cases approach prima in those early applications. But approach followed by approach primo was common, or has been common. We look forward to using Forcevo more in that latter foliar time, and we have a full spectrum of fungicides that can do a great job covering those diseases that I highlighted. Forcevo, Ron had indicated that I would spend a little bit more time on this particular product. We are excited to have this. This is our first, or we're going into the first mainstream high volume type of a launch with Forcevo. It's got 3 powerful modes of action, as many other 3-ways have. The categories Ron had highlighted earlier: strobilurins, triazoles, and the SDHI is another category. Most of the 3-ways on the market, the vast majority have those 3 modes of action covered. The uniqueness with Forcevo is that it's got a novel or unique SDHI component that has just recently come to the market. So we're happy with what we're seeing there, as far as providing benefits. And one of those benefits is long-lasting residual. The SDHI component is important in terms of residual deeper into the growing season. And so what we've seen from this product is very outstanding disease control relative to some of the other products that have been on the market. The last point there is Forcevo. Hopefully you just remember it forces control of those tough diseases that I talked about. But we're definitely seeing more uptake with Forcevo, and like what we've seen in the market from it. And as Ron said, it is used primarily in corn. That is kind of its best fit. Fits like a glove for those diseases we're really trying to handle in corn production. We look at that compared to some of the top other fungicides that are in the market. We've seen a very high yield response to the untreated, in that teen category, 17 bushel in this comparison. And then looking in comparison to some of those top performing competitors, we've seen obviously a smaller advantage there, but still a very favorable advantage for where we have Forcevo in the market and where it's priced. Approach Prima, as Ron had indicated, I mean, it is a very proven product that we've had in the market. We've been very happy with how it's performed in terms of the value that this product brings. It does have faster uptake and movement within a plant. And what we've seen as well is that long-lasting residual. So it's done well in terms of um, sticking around and controlling the diseases as they develop in the course of the season. It also has very flexible application in terms of when you can apply it, which is important for you to adjust according to what the weather patterns might bring and when the diseases would be developing. Again, on Approach Prima, we've seen very competitive yield responses there and good ROI for the growers that have used it. When you look at compared to the untreated, we definitely see 10 plus bushel yield responses in a lot of cases, and in some cases it goes a lot higher than that relative to the disease pressure and how much the yield is being threatened in the corn crop. Shifting to insects, there's a long list here for corn. I'm not going to go into a lot of them in great detail. As Ron indicated, the seed treatments that we have now really do a great job of addressing some of those early season insects that we have in corn. And again, tying into the weather, my experience, heck, I was around in 1988 in the drought year, so I can't get that out of my mind. When you got hot, dry, and that's kind of what has been forecasted potentially even in the eastern Midwest, I start thinking insects because I saw insect outbreaks that year more dramatic than I've ever seen since. I sure hope that we're not staging or setting up for that kind of a thing, but whereas Ron had indicated, cool, wet conditions can favor a lot of diseases. If we go into a hot, dry pattern, well, that tends to favor some insects. And so as we look at some of the insects, one of the things that in corn, probably more so in the Midwest than in soybeans, we're using traded corn to help manage some of these insects that were substantial economic problems in the past, like the corn rootworm and European corn borer. Even some of the southwestern borers or the ironworms. It's just nice that we have some tools today to help us manage those challenges. But at times, not everybody uses those trait platforms. Plus, there's insects that can overcome them at times. And as Ron indicated with Ridgeback, I'm not going to take as much time with it. But it is a very nice, economically priced, broad spectrum product that can not only be used in soybeans, but also for many of the corn insect problems that can develop in the course of the season. Some of the challenge we get into with corn insect control, though, is just can we get the insecticide to where those insects are? As you look at the western bean cutworm or some of the late season insects, that's one of the considerations you need to give. The nice thing about Ridgeback is it'll control a lot of those if you get in contact, but you would want to talk to your local territory manager, local experts in terms of how to manage the application logistics. With that, I think I'm handing it back to Ron here on Enlist best management practices.
Yeah, we thought we'd be a bit remiss as we're heading into a lot of Enlist applications to not at least talk about the best management practices. And I want you all to think this is not just soybeans, but if you have power core or vorseed corn, especially as we get late season, you need an little extra boost, say with your Resicor Rev type of products. Enlist is a very good option. It's going to land and stay on product and be neighbor friendly for you in the corn system. But also thinking of the soybean system, these are the practices that we find lead to happy customers that want to continue with their Enlist program. First and foremost, spray when those weeds are small. And we look at something like water hemp that can grow an inch a day. I want to stress that inch a day growth doesn't start from the day that it comes through the soil. When it first comes through the soil, It takes about a week to get to a half inch. It takes another week to get to about an inch, almost another week to get to 2 inches. But you go one more week and it goes from 2 inches to 12 inches. There's your inch a day type of growth once it hits about that 2 or 3 inch stage. That's why we really stress with water hemp, catch it in before it goes to that rapid growth stage so that you can knock the growth points out quicker than they can put new growth points on. All right. So good timing. All right. We want actively growing weeds. Warm and humid conditions are the best. And fortunately, our meteorologists, by and large, are going to give us that, except not so good on the humidity. We're a little light on humidity on the western part of the Corn Belt here. Now, I did last week had a chance to travel to Indiana, and boy, as you get east, that humidity just kind of kicks this old Westerner's rear end a little bit. I'm not used to that much humidity. Of course, manage full rates and use, and we don't list it here, but use a good tank mix partner. We always list with Enlist that we want 2 modes of action working on those broadleaf weeds, in part for resistance management, and in part because we just want complete control so that we knock them all the way out. There are qualified nozzles that are, it's an EPA requirement, but it's also the right thing to do. We want nozzles that will give us the best coverage, but yet keep it on target. So if you'll notice in our qualified nozzle list, those nozzles are either have green print or yellow print. Green print is what we highly recommend for the striking the right balance between good coverage and on target. The yellow, that's more of a caution, is boy, if I'm in a really, really sensitive area for drift, then you might want to gravitate towards those yellow colored ones. Those are the ones that give you a coarser droplet, a bigger droplet, which frankly gives you less coverage on the leaves. So we try to avoid those unless we're in an extreme drift sensitive area. Along that same lines, keep your pressure up towards the upper end of the range. That helps to push that product deeper in. Remember, on water hemp, you gotta kill every growth point all the way up and down that plant. So make sure you have the high pressure to get it all the way down to those bottom growth points. And then in that same vein, gallonage. I do like to see Liberty used as a tank mix partner because everybody kind of accepts the fact with Liberty, hey, I got to get that water gallonage up there to 15 or 20 gallons. That's good for Liberty. It's mandatory for Liberty, but it's good or better with your Enlist application as well. You just get more coverage, and more coverage is more control. And then finally, use the appropriate adjuvants. Here in the dry part of the world, as we go west, we've mostly gravitated to the most aggressive adjuvant, which is methylated seed oil. And in addition to the methylated seed oil, we also recommend ammonium sulfate, AMS. You want to use both. All right, as you get into higher humidity, that's where people might back the methylated oil down to a crop oil. But what are we expecting from these adjuvants? Well, from the AMS, we're expecting, some water conditioning, some pH balancing. It does help a little with uptake. From the oils, we're expecting good spread, good sticking, evaporation. It helps to reduce the evaporation. And the other thing the oils do, and this is really important when humidity is low, it helps penetrate that thick cuticle wax that plants naturally have in a drought, so that we can get that chemical in to translocate into the rest of the system.
Well, folks, we've reached the top of our hour. It's been a quick hour here. Just like farming in the weather, even webinars have glitches too. And we all managed to get through that here today as well. But I think we've done a nice job of really forecasting the weather, what we think is going to go on. We know 2026, there's a lot of folks trying to make sure we spend the dollar wisely. That's why we scout, whether that's insects or disease, corn and soybeans. There's nothing worse than spending money on something that's going to not give you value back. By scouting, you can get the biggest bang for your buck. And then obviously the best management practices. The less trips we got to make across the field, the better weed control we get. Those are all positive things from an ROI perspective. And Ron did a nice job there. There's also at the same time a lot of other modules or training guides. I'm going to leave this up here. Use your phones, grab the QR codes here if you want some additional information. If you have any questions for our speaker, please use that Q&A function, and we will try to do our best to stay on the line as long as we can. So with that, folks, reach out for that Q&A. I do want to thank Matt. Brett, thanks for taking time today and talking with all our Corteva customers out there. Ron, Scott, great job as always. And folks, reach out for those questions.